Picture this. It's October 1907. Wall Street is burning. Not literally, but it might as well be. Panic-stricken crowds swarm every bank in New York, desperate to withdraw their life savings before it all disappears. The President of the United States sits helpless in Washington. The world's most powerful economy is 48 hours from complete collapse. And the only man who can save it? He's not a politician, not a general. He's a 70-year-old banker with a disfigured nose and a terrible cold, locked in his private library with the nation's most powerful financiers, refusing to let them leave until they agreed to his plan. His name was J.P. Morgan. And this is the story of how one man became more powerful than the United States government itself, and why that terrified everyone, including the presidents who needed him. The making of a titan, the Lonely Island. Most origin stories of great men start with ambition and hunger. J.P. Morgan's story starts with isolation on a remote island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The year was 1853. 16-year-old John Pierpont Morgan, pale, sickly, racked with rheumatic fever, was sent alone to the Azores by his father, not as punishment, but as medicine. His father believed the salty air would cure what ailed his son. So, there John stayed, for nearly a year, with no family, nothing but books and the endless horizon. While other wealthy teenagers attended balls and made connections, young Morgan learned to be alone with his thoughts, to rely on no one, to solve his own problems. When crisis comes, you can only depend on yourself. That lesson would define everything he became. The trader who broke the rules. By 1859, Morgan was working at a Wall Street banking firm. Most young bankers would have played it safe. Not Morgan. While on a business trip to New Orleans, the 22-year-old noticed a ship carrying an entire cargo of Brazilian coffee with no buyer. Without asking permission, Morgan used company funds to purchase the entire shipment. His bosses were furious. His father was appalled. But Morgan sold that coffee and made a handsome profit. The lesson they took away? This kid's dangerous. They were right. Love and loss. Just as Morgan's career was beginning, he fell deeply in love with Amelia Sturgis. They married in 1861, and for a few brief months, Morgan knew genuine happiness. But Amelia had tuberculosis. Morgan took her to the Mediterranean, desperately hoping a change of climate would save her. Just as his father tried with him, it didn't work. 4 months after the wedding, Amelia died, leaving Morgan a widower at 24. Friends said he never truly recovered. The man who would control billions never found what he'd briefly had with Amelia. And perhaps that's why he threw himself so completely into his work. When you've lost the one thing you love the most, power becomes an acceptable substitute. The architecture of monopoly. The Railroad Revolution. In 1871, Morgan partnered with Anthony Drexel to create what would become J.P. Morgan & Co. And he'd identified his first major play, America's chaotic railroad industry. While Carnegie dominated steel and Rockefeller controlled oil, the railroads were a mess. Dozens of competing lines, slashing prices, going bankrupt. Most investors saw chaos. Morgan saw opportunity. His strategy was brilliantly simple. Why compete when you can consolidate? Morgan would acquire struggling railroads, merge them with competitors, and suddenly no more competition. Just one dominant player that could charge whatever it wanted. But here's what made Morgan different. He didn't just invest and walk away. He demanded complete control. If a railroad wanted his financing, his terms were non-negotiable. He got a board seat, he installed management. Every major decision went through him. This became so successful it got its own name, Morganization. And it worked spectacularly. The man who owned America's highways. Morgan didn't just buy a few railroads. He systematically acquired them until he controlled 1/3 of all railroad mileage in America. And railroads made up 60% of the entire US stock market. In modern terms, imagine one person controlling 20% of the stock market. That was Morgan's position. He didn't just own tracks. He owned the ability for goods and people to move across America. Want to ship steel from Pittsburgh to Chicago? Morgan's railroad. Grain from Kansas to New York? Morgan. Cattle from Texas? Morgan, Morgan, Morgan. He had achieved something unprecedented: private control over public infrastructure. The monster and the president. Morgan's appearance matched his power. He suffered from rosacea and rhinophyma, conditions that turned his nose bright red, bulbous, and covered in lesions. He was deeply self-conscious and ordered photographers to retouch it. But in person, there was no retouching. Combined with his piercing gaze and aggressive manner, meeting J.P. Morgan was said to be terrifying. For years, Morgan operated with virtually no oversight. But in 1901, President McKinley was assassinated, and Theodore Roosevelt became president. A trust-buster who believed monopolies threatened democracy itself. When Morgan created the Northern Securities Corporation by merging 3 major railroads, Roosevelt struck. He sued. Morgan actually went to the White House and said, "If we have done anything wrong, send your man to my man and they can fix it up." Roosevelt's response? "That's not how this works. The government isn't your business partner." Morgan lost. Northern Securities was broken up. When Roosevelt announced he was going on safari in Africa, Morgan quipped, "I hope the first lion he meets does his duty." The billion-dollar play. But Roosevelt's victory was Pyrrhic. Morgan's next move would be his most audacious yet. Andrew Carnegie wanted to retire and sell his steel company. Morgan met with him and asked him to write down his price. Carnegie wrote $480 million, the largest business transaction in world history. Morgan looked at the number and said, "I accept." Later, he admitted he would have paid $100 million more. But Morgan didn't buy Carnegie Steel to run a steel company. He merged it with Federal Steel and others to form U.S. Steel, the world's first billion-dollar corporation capitalized at $1.4 billion. The entire U.S. manufacturing sector was worth $9 billion. Morgan had just created a company worth 15% of that. He now controlled 2/3 of American steel production. Combined with his railroad empire, Morgan effectively controlled how America built itself and moved goods. He had become infrastructure incarnate. The man who was the central bank. The Panic of 1893. Morgan's power wasn't just about wealth. It was about trust. And nowhere was this more evident than in the Panic of 1893. The stock market lost nearly half its value. Thousands of businesses closed. Hundreds of banks failed. But the real problem was gold. The US dollar was backed by gold. The government needed at least $100 million in reserves to maintain confidence. By early 1895, they only had $9 million left, enough for maybe 48 hours before the United States would default. President Cleveland was desperate. Traditional solutions weren't working. They needed an immediate massive injection of gold. There was only one person who could deliver: J.P. Morgan, the private bailout. Morgan traveled to Washington with an audacious plan. He would form a private syndicate of bankers who would purchase $65 million in government bonds using 3.5 million ounces of gold. Think about what that means. A private citizen was going to bail out the United States government. Cleveland had no choice. Using an obscure Civil War statute, he approved Morgan's plan. Morgan wired New York, and within 22 minutes, the deal was done. Markets stabilized. Confidence returned. America was saved. But here's the question. Should any private citizen have this much power? Morgan had just proven he could single-handedly rescue the US economy, which meant he could theoretically destroy it as well. And of course, Morgan had made a fortune on the deal. Patriot or opportunist? The answer is both. The panic of 1907. Morgan's finest hour. 12 years later, it happened again. The panic of 1907 spiraled into a full banking crisis. Lines wrapped around blocks. Banks were running out of cash. The financial system was collapsing. President Theodore Roosevelt, the same man who sued Morgan, swallowed his pride and asked for help. Morgan, now 70, suffering from a cold, summoned the most powerful financiers to his private library. He literally locked them inside, forbidden to leave until they had agreed on a solution. Morgan's plan: healthy banks would pool resources and inject capital into weaker banks to prevent total collapse. The bankers argued through the night. Morgan, coughing and sneezing, orchestrated it all. By morning, they had an agreement. The Treasury added $25 million. The plan worked. The crisis was averted. Once again, J.P. Morgan had saved America. The reckoning. But this time, victory felt hollow. The American people had just witnessed the entire U.S. economy depending on one 70-year-old banker with a cold. What if Morgan had died? What if he'd refused? What if his plan had failed? This was the moment America realized it needed a central bank. Not a private citizen acting as one, but an actual institution. The panic of 1907 led directly to the creation of Federal Reserve in 1913. Ironically, Morgan had made himself obsolete. By being too successful, too powerful, too essential, he'd proven that no private citizen should ever be in this position again. The fall and the legacy. The Peugeot Committee. In 1912, Morgan was summoned to testify before the Peugeot Committee, a congressional investigation into a handful of bankers who controlled the vast swaths of the economy. Morgan was the star witness. Congressmen grilled him for hours. In one famous exchange, when asked about the foundation of commercial credit, Morgan gave an answer that revealed his worldview. Is not commercial credit based primarily on money or property? Morgan: no, sir. The first thing is character. Before money or anything else, money cannot buy it. He genuinely believed this. Business wasn't just about money. It was about trust, character, relationships. He'd earned his power through proving his reliability in crisis after crisis. But the public didn't see it that way. They saw a man who controlled more wealth than nations, who could make or break companies with a word. The mental strain crushed him. Despite his success, Morgan suffered multiple nervous breakdowns. The constant criticism destroyed him psychologically. Ironically, he'd booked a passage on the Titanic's maiden voyage, but cancelled due to illness. The death of a titan. On March 31st, 1913, J.P. Morgan died in Rome at 75, broken in spirit. He'd lived to see the investigation that would create the Federal Reserve, the institution that would replace him, but died before seeing it come to fruition. When his will was read, his personal fortune was $80 million. John D. Rockefeller, upon reading this, said, and to think, he wasn't even a rich man. Rockefeller was worth over $1 billion. Why was Morgan's fortune smaller? Because his real wealth wasn't in the bank account. It was in his power to move money. He didn't need to own billions because he controlled access to billions. He was the gatekeeper, the kingmaker. The legacy. A bank too big to fail. In 2000, The bank merged with Chase to become JP Morgan Chase. Today, it has over $3 trillion in assets, the largest bank in the United States. When the 2008 financial crisis hit, JP Morgan Chase acquired Bear Stearns and Washington Mutual, consolidating power during crisis, exactly as JP Morgan had done a century earlier. The government deemed it too big to fail, meaning its collapse would destroy the economy. Sound familiar? JP Morgan created this template. Consolidate during crises. Acquire competitors. Become so large the government has no choice but to protect you. The bank bearing his name proves his strategy still works. A puzzling question for you here is, was JP Morgan a hero or a villain? A patriotic savior or an opportunistic monopolist? He was both. He was a product of his time who saw that in the absence of government power, private power would fill the void. So, he made sure it was his. He saved America multiple times. He also concentrated enough power to terrify America. He built institutions that still shape our economy. He also proved why no single person should ever have that much influence again. JP Morgan's greatest achievement wasn't creating wealth or building monopolies. It was proving that the modern economy is too complex to be controlled by one person, even a genius like him. And yet, more than a century later, we're still wrestling with the same questions he embodied. How much power should banks have? When they become essential to the economy, who really controls whom? And what happens when institutions meant to protect us become too big to fail? JP Morgan didn't answer these questions. He became them. And his bank, still bearing his name, still wielding enormous power, is proof we haven't found the answers either.